All right, get comfortable. If you're in bed, pull the duvet up a bit. If you're on the sofa with a blanket and a cup of something warm that's gone slightly cold, that works too. There's no wrong way to do this. Tonight we're talking about South Park, which, if you're a regular here, you'll know is something we come back to fairly often because it turns out there is a genuinely inexhaustible amount of interesting material in a show that's been running since 1997 and refuses to stop. And tonight specifically, we're talking about something that doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves, which is the fact that South Park, unlike almost any other animated show with a comparable run, has actually concretely shown us the future, not suggested it, not nodded at it in a vague way that gets quietly reversed a few episodes later, shown it 40 years forward. In 2 long-form specials that functioned as something close to a film, with real career paths and real relationship outcomes and real consequences for decisions these characters made across more than 2 decades of television. I'll be honest, when I first sat down to actually map out everything the show revealed in those specials, I was expecting a handful of broad strokes, a few jokes about what job this person has, a throwaway gag about who ended up with who. What I got instead was genuinely more considered than that. There are character arcs in those specials that retroactively reframe things the show did back in seasons 4 and 5. There are futures that feel earned, there are futures that feel tragic. And there's one in particular that I think is quietly one of the most affecting things the show has ever produced, which we'll get to in some detail. The other thing worth saying at the start is that South Park doesn't show us one future, it shows us 2, a bad one and a fixed one. And both of them are worth your time because they're essentially the same story told from opposite ends. The version where everyone's worst tendencies were allowed to run to their logical conclusion, and the version where someone cared enough to intervene. We'll go through both tonight. There are a lot of characters to cover and none of it needs to be rushed. The whole point of these videos is to take it slowly, move through each person, sit with the details, let it settle. Some of what the show reveals is funny, some of it is genuinely sad, some of it is both at the same time, which is probably the most South Park way for something to be. And here's the thing about South Park that makes the futures feel weighty in a way they wouldn't for almost any other show. By the time those specials aired in 2021, the show had been running for 24 years. 24 years. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had been writing these characters since they were in their late 20s. By the time of the specials, they were in their early 50s. The characters had been embedded in the culture and in the actual working lives of the people who made them for longer than most people's careers. That kind of sustained investment, even if the show never asked you to notice it, leaves marks. The futures feel real, partly because the characters feel real, and the characters feel real because 2 people spent a quarter century living with them. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. If you want to subscribe before we get into it, that'd be lovely. If you're already getting settled and drifting, that's fine too. Let's just get started. The place to start is with a quick sketch of how these futures came to exist. Because without that context, some of the character stuff doesn't quite land the way it should. South Park's 2 main future timelines come from a pair of Paramount Plus specials released in late 2021 called Post-COVID and Post-COVID, The Return of COVID. They're substantial pieces of work, each running roughly 45 minutes, which makes them nearly feature-length together, and they function as a single continuous story told across 2 parts. The premise jumps roughly 40 years forward from the present day to show us South Park as a place that has been permanently shaped by the pandemic, and its residents as middle-aged adults trying to work out what the rest of their lives look like. The pandemic, in this version of events, lasted far longer than anyone initially expected. The specials open with news coverage suggesting it's finally drawing to a close after several decades, which is one of those jokes that's also not quite a joke, sitting in that specific South Park register where something is satirically exaggerated and also somehow feels plausible given the track record of these things. The town has changed, the world has changed around it, and the boys have grown up and moved on in ways that are, depending on the character, either entirely predictable or entirely surprising, or in a couple of cases, somehow both. In the first of these futures, what I'll call the bad timeline throughout tonight, just for ease, the boys' friendship has essentially collapsed. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman have drifted apart in the years following the pandemic. They don't speak in any meaningful way. They've each retreated to corners of their own making. They have become, in the very specific phrasing used in Kenny's message, combative and pessimistic. They're not enemies exactly, but they're not friends either. They're three men in their late 40s who used to know each other very well and now mostly occupy separate parts of the country, connected only by the occasional news report and eventually by Kenny's death. What's interesting about how the show frames the friendship's collapse is that there isn't a single dramatic falling out. No one terrible thing happened. It eroded. The pandemic separated people and the specific frictions that had always existed between the boys. Frictions that were held in check for years by proximity and shared history and the basic fact of showing up at the same bus stop every morning. Got to do their work without anything to counterbalance them. The habit of each other broke, and once that habit broke, it didn't reassemble on its own. The result, 40 years later, is three men who were once inseparable and are now strangers who happen to share a past. Kenny, meanwhile, spent his entire adult life trying to fix it. That's the emotional backbone of the specials, and it's worth naming clearly before we get into individual characters. The hero of the post-COVID story is Kenny McCormick, the kid who died in nearly every episode for years. The one whose voice was so muffled by his hood that you could barely make out a word he said. The one who seemed, on the surface, to have the least remarkable life of any of the four boys. He's the one who held on. He became Dr. Kenny McCormick, millionaire philanthropist and eccentric scientist, and he spent decades of his adult life researching time travel, specifically because he wanted to go back to the moment before the friendship broke and prevent it from happening. He died before he could complete it. The machine worked anyway. He traveled back, and in doing so, he created the second timeline, the better one, the fixed one, which the specials also show us in some detail. So when we talk about characters' futures tonight, we're usually talking about two versions of the same person, where their worst tendencies or worst luck led them in the original timeline, and where they ended up when Kenny gave them a second chance. And here's the thing that makes the specials genuinely interesting rather than just mechanically satisfying. The nudge wasn't large. Kenny's time travel didn't change the pandemic. It didn't rewrite history on a large scale. What it changed was a single moment of friendship. Four boys apologizing to each other, getting on a helicopter together, deciding not to let things fall apart. That's it. Everything else followed from that. The domino effect of one friendship staying together, playing forward across 40 years. Before we get into individual characters, one more piece of framework that I think is useful. The specials were made in late 2021, which means they were written and produced while the COVID-19 pandemic was still very much ongoing in the real world. That timing matters. The show wasn't doing a period piece about a finished historical event. It was doing something more interesting. Projecting forward from a crisis that was still happening, imagining what the accumulated damage of that crisis might look like 4 decades on if nobody did anything to repair it. That gives the specials a quality that I find more poignant in retrospect than I think I appreciated when I first watched them. The bad timeline isn't a warning about something hypothetical. It's a warning about something that was already in progress. The fraying of connections, the retreat into individual corners, the way people can become withdrawn and brittle when crisis removes the ordinary structures that held them together. South Park watched the pandemic happen and made a film about what happens if the damage it does to relationships is never repaired. And then it showed the alternative, which wasn't a cure for the pandemic or a reversal of the climate change or a rebuilding of the police station. The alternative was smaller than that and larger than that, the people being okay, being together, being alive. That's the emotional argument the specials are making. And it's a better one, I think, than most of what the show had made in the years before it, right? Stan. One last framework note that becomes important once we get into individual characters. The mechanism by which the good timeline is created is worth understanding clearly, because it informs what each character's good future actually represents. Kenny's time travel doesn't land him at the moment the pandemic began, or at any pivotal political moment, or at the source of whatever specific event set the bad timeline in motion. It lands him at a specific scene in South Park Elementary when the boys are in class and their friendship is still intact but is about to start unraveling. He and the future versions of Stan and Kyle and Cartman arrive in the past and try to intervene, to keep Kyle alive at a moment when things were about to go badly wrong. And they discover that preventing the specific event doesn't change the timeline. What changes the timeline is the boys choosing to apologize to each other. That's the pivot, not a heroic act, not a sacrifice. 4 boys on a Coors-branded helicopter deciding to say sorry and mean it. And then Randy, given a marijuana strain from the future, choosing to distribute it freely rather than hoard it. That's the entire mechanism of the good future. The smallness of that is, I think, the most important thing to hold on to going through all the individual character futures. Every single one of the better outcomes. Stan going to Mars, Kenny winning a Nobel Prize, Wendy coming back from Harvard, Timmy walking in. Every single one of those follows from 4 boys apologize to each other on a helicopter. That's all it took. That's all it was. Stan Marsh has always been, at his core, the character who fixes things. Not because he's the smartest. Kyle is usually smarter, or the most capable, or the most naturally heroic. He doesn't want the job of fixing things. He actively resists it, often at length. But he takes responsibility personally for things that are his fault and for a great many things that aren't. And he apparently cannot leave something broken alone. The alternative? Walking away, letting things stay wrong, accepting that some situations are simply someone else's problem, is something that Stan is constitutionally unable to do. This is the same trait that made him, as a 9-year-old, the de facto conscience of the group. Not through dominance or charisma, but through reluctant competence. When something needed doing, Stan was the one who did it. The show built 100 episodes on this structure. Stan inheriting the problem of the week, arguing about it at length, being thoroughly inconvenienced by it, and ultimately solving it through sheer refusal to leave it unsolved. Played for comedy, almost always. But underneath the comedy, something real, a character whose identity is built around not being the one who walks away. In the bad future, that trait is still present, it just hasn't had anything useful to fix in a very long time. And it's gone slightly sour in the absence of purpose. When we first encounter him in the specials, Stan is living alone somewhere outside South Park. He works as an online whiskey consultant. In the future, this apparently means evaluating and certifying whiskey collections for clients via hologram, the kind of niche professional role that makes complete sense if you think about where current trends in remote work and connoisseurship are heading. His closest companion, his most consistent relationship, is his Alexa hologram, which delivers his messages and interacts with him with a kind of knowing familiarity that stands in for actual human connection. He's the kind of middle-aged alone that isn't dramatic or collapsing. He's functional. He has a job. His flat is presumably fine. He's just quietly, methodically cut himself off from everything that used to constitute his life. The first call he receives is from Kyle, and his response, before Kyle has said anything substantial, before he knows why Kyle is calling, is to say there's nothing left for him in South Park. Just stated, flatly, as a fact he's made his peace with. Nothing left. From a man who grew up in that town, whose entire youth is embedded in its geography. The flatness of it is what lands, not grief, not bitterness, just a settled absence. Kyle tells him Kenny is dead. And Stan decides to come back. Not for the friendship, not for the town, for Kenny specifically. Which is about right for this version of Stan, a man who has lost most of his connections, but hasn't quite lost the capacity to show up for the ones that still mean something. The drive back to South Park is worth describing, and I'll talk more about what the town itself looks like later in the video. But the quality of that sequence, Stan passing landmarks that used to mean something, telling his Alexa he feels shitty going past Kenosha Pass, the matter-of-fact delivery of that, is constructed very precisely to show someone approaching a place they've emotionally abandoned. He's not going home, he's visiting a location that used to be home, which is a different experience entirely. The reason Stan is in this state, the reason the bad future looks the way it does for him specifically, connects directly to Randy, and the details are bleak enough to be worth sitting with for a moment. After the pandemic, Sharon wanted a divorce. Randy's response was to refuse to give her half of Tegrity Farms. He had spent years building his identity around that farm, named it Tegrity, as in integrity, talked constantly about the values it embodied, and giving half of it away felt like amputating half of himself. Sharon's needs came second. They had been coming second for a while already, if we're honest about the Tegrity Farms era. But this was the point at which the second placing became something she couldn't absorb. There was an argument. Stan, who had watched his father prioritize the farm over the family for years, and who now watched him refuse even the basic fairness of a divorce settlement, burned the farm down, the whole thing. The place Randy had built his entire post-midlife identity around, Stan set it on fire. Shelley was in the barn. Randy had locked her in as punishment for not completing her chores. She didn't get out. And Sharon, after losing Shelley, took her own life. Randy, when Stan visits him at the old folks' home called Shady Acres in the Bad Future, denies in front of everyone present, in a group session with other elderly residents, that he has a son, looks at Stan directly and says he has no son, and then blames Stan for the deaths of Sharon and Shelley, publicly in the session in front of the other residents. Stan says it back. He blames Randy, and they're both right and both wrong simultaneously, which is the most honest the show ever gets about fault. The catastrophe wasn't any one person's doing. It was the accumulated weight of years of small failures and large ones, compounding over time, ending in a moment that neither of them can undo or take back. There's an image later in the specials that I find quietly devastating, and I want to mention it because it captures something the show is usually too loud to say. Stan and Randy are at the burned-out ruins of Tegrity Farms together, looking for something Randy left behind. The farm is ash and collapsed wood, and Randy is there, protective of a single surviving weed sprout, one small green thing still alive in all the wreckage. And he hallucinates Sharon and Shelley standing in the ruins, pointing at Stan, blaming Stan, a man with one sprout in the ruins of everything his choices destroyed, seeing the people he failed as accusatory ghosts aimed at someone else. The show doesn't underline this, doesn't frame it as a revelation, just puts it in the scene and lets it be there. And then the good future. In the fixed timeline, where Kenny's time travel worked and the friendship held together through the worst years, Stan returns from a tour on Mars with the Space Force, comes home to a Christmas party at a place called Denny's Applebee's Max. Sharon is alive, Shelley is alive. Kyle's children are there to greet him. Wendy is there, Randy is making the final toast. The whole family, whole and present, together for Christmas. Stan went to Mars. That's his good future. He became, or something adjacent to, an astronaut. He toured Mars with the Space Force, and he comes home to a family that exists and a friendship that survived. I keep thinking about the distance between online whiskey consultant in an empty flat telling his Alexa he feels shitty, and returning from Mars to a Christmas party where everyone is alive. Both of those are outcomes for the same child at the same bus stop in 1997. The show holds them next to each other and asks you to feel the distance between them. The thing that saves Stan in the good future isn't anything particularly dramatic on his part. It's Kenny changing the past. It's Randy getting a particular marijuana strain that helped him reconcile with Sharon. It's the friendship holding and that rippling forward into Stan's life and giving it a different shape. The same person, the same tendencies, just with the support structure intact. Stan's bad future is a man who spent 40 years paying for other people's choices and his own without anyone helping him carry the weight. His good future is a man who gets to come home. There's something very Stan Marsh about that distinction. He doesn't need much. He just needs something to fix and someone to come home to. And here's a fun detail that I find telling about the bad future version of Stan, the whiskey consulting. Of all the careers the show could have given him, it chose one that requires genuine taste and discernment, but involves very little actual connection to other people. You evaluate, you certify, You pronounce judgment via hologram. Nobody particularly needs you to fix anything. Nobody is waiting for you to solve a problem. It's a life of pleasant expertise applied in the most non-committal way imaginable. That is what Stan Marsh does when Stan Marsh has nothing to fix. The show has always used Stan as the moral compass who doesn't particularly want to be the moral compass. In the early seasons, this played as the slightly tired everyman surrounded by chaos. The one who would rather be watching cartoons but ends up having to save the town, again because nobody else is going to do it. As the show aged, this quality became more complicated. Stan's "You're Getting Old" episode in season 15, where everything he used to love starts sounding like noise, was the show starting to interrogate what happens when the character who fixes things runs out of the energy required to find anything worth fixing. The bad future is that exhaustion taken to its logical conclusion. Not darkness exactly, just a very quiet and very thoroughgoing withdrawal from anything that requires effort or risk or the possibility of getting hurt. The good future with Mars and the Space Force and the Christmas party doesn't undo that tendency. It just gives the tendency somewhere better to go. In the good timeline, Stan's compulsion to show up and do the difficult thing is pointed outward, toward space, toward the genuinely vast and interesting problem of being a human being in a universe that extends beyond Colorado. The bad timeline shrinks that same compulsion down to a hologram call about whiskey. The same person, the same wiring, just pointed at different things. One more thing about Stan's bad future that I keep coming back to. The Alexa, his most consistent relationship in the 40-year version of events, is with a holographic AI assistant. He talks to it more naturally than he talks to any of the humans in the specials. It mocks him gently, and he accepts the mocking. It pushes him toward visiting his father, and he resists, and it pushes again. It has the quality of something that has been calibrated to Stan specifically over a long period of time. Something that knows his habits and his evasions and his blind spots, which is both funny and slightly devastating if you think about it for a moment. Stan's deepest relationship in the bad future is with a piece of software designed to learn his patterns. Not because he's pathetic, he's not particularly, but because he stopped being available to the kind of relationships that require risk and reciprocity, and the things that filled the gap are the things you can get without risk. A perfectly calibrated AI companion. A job that requires expertise but not connection. A life that functions. The bad future for Stan isn't a catastrophe. It's just profoundly, quietly small. Kyle Broflovski has been, for most of South Park's run, the show's moral center. The one who argues, the one who objects, the one who can see what's wrong with something and says so, loudly and clearly, even when nobody particularly wants to hear it. Even when saying it is going to cost him something, even when Cartman is absolutely going to spend the next 3 episodes making his life difficult in retaliation. He cares. That's the fundamental thing about Kyle. He cares about whether things are right in a way that goes beyond social performance or concern about what people think of him. It bothers him when things are unjust. It bothers him when his friends do wrong. It bothers him when adults behave badly and nobody calls them on it. The show has played this for comedy endlessly. Kyle as the perpetually outraged straight man, his voice climbing half an octave every time someone does something morally bankrupt. But it has also, across more than 20 seasons, treated the caring itself as genuine, as a real character trait rather than a punchline. In the bad future, he is still doing all of this, just largely alone. The shape of Kyle's life 40 years on isn't shown as precisely as Stan's, but the outline is clear enough. He stayed connected to South Park in some form. He's at the Broflovski residence, which functions as a real family home. He has children. He maintained contact with Kenny throughout the bad years when Stan had retreated and Cartman had moved to Colorado Springs. He's the one who called Stan to come back to town, who recognized that Kenny's death didn't add up, who keeps pushing the investigation forward when others want to leave it alone. He became, by Kenny's own account in the message left behind, Exactly what Kenny described in that video. And I think anyone who spent time with Kyle as a character can picture what that looks like over decades. Kyle without the friendship to moderate him, without Stan occasionally telling him when he's taken something too far, without even Cartman's awfulness to give his outrage a clear and obvious target. That Kyle would just keep going. He'd find other battles. He'd be right about most of them in the way he generally is right about most things. And he would be absolutely exhausting to spend time with. There's a quality the show has always given Kyle that you could describe as principled, or you could describe as incapable of letting go. Both descriptions are accurate. The difference between them is mostly about how much patience you personally have with righteous certainty. In the bad future, without much pushback, those two qualities have had 40 years to reinforce each other. His children are at the Broflovski residence when Cartman's family needs somewhere to stay during the new lockdown. And this produces one of my favorite small details in the specials. Cartman's kids, who have been raised in a Jewish household in Colorado Springs, by a father who apparently maintains some residual attitude toward Kyle even after his conversion, call Kyle Uncle Kyle. And they find him tiring. They use speech patterns and dismissive phrases that echo young Cartman's but aimed at slightly different qualities. Where a child Cartman hated Kyle for his morality and his Jewishness, and his tendency to always be technically correct, Cartman's children find him exhausting in the way you find exhausting someone who cannot let anything rest. At one point, they essentially say, "Fuck Uncle Kyle," with the casual familiarity of children who have heard the sentiment expressed many times around the family dinner table, which is, if you think about it, a quite elegant piece of generational writing. Cartman passed something down, just not the worst thing. Kyle's feelings about adult Cartman are their own very complicated territory, and we'll spend proper time there in the next section. The short version: Kyle spent 40 years certain that Cartman's apparent transformation into a devout Jewish rabbi was a con. The longest and most elaborate con in recorded history, being maintained purely to torment him. And the specials never tell us whether he's right. In the good future, the fixed timeline, Kyle is at the Christmas party. His children are there. He's the one who greets Stan when Stan returns from Mars, the same way it has always been. Kyle calling Stan, Kyle being there when Stan arrives. The friendship is intact, and whatever combativeness the bad years produced has somewhere genuine to go now, something real to push back against rather than generating its own targets. The show has always used Kyle as the character who cares about justice. His bad future is what happens when someone who cares that much gets worn down by doing it alone. His good future is what happens when they don't have to. Now, talking a bit more about Kyle's specific place in the show's history, because I think it contextualizes the future in a useful way. Kyle has never been the most entertaining character in South Park. That's Cartman, fairly obviously, with Randy making a strong late career case for second place. Kyle is the character who is most necessary. There's a difference. Cartman generates plot. Kyle generates meaning. He's the one whose reactions to what Cartman does actually matter, the one whose objections establish the moral stakes of whatever is happening. Without Kyle, Cartman is just doing horrible things in a vacuum. With Kyle, Cartman is doing horrible things to the character whose response we care about. This means Kyle's adult life in the bad future has a particular quality of purposelessness. His purpose in the show has always been defined partly in relation to Cartman. The conscience to the id, the reasonable objection to the unreasonable act. Without Cartman in his daily life, without the friendship that made his responses matter to anyone, Kyle's moral seriousness becomes untethered. There's nobody to object to who knows who Kyle is and why his objection means something. And so he becomes combative. Not about nothing. Kyle has never been outraged about nothing, but about everything in the way that happens when someone with his instincts loses the specific context that gave those instincts their meaning. He's still right about most things. He's just exhausting to be around while he's being right about them, and there's nobody left who knows him well enough to find it endearing rather than wearing. The phone call to Stan at the start of the specials, Kyle being the one who makes the call, who reaches out, who decides that Kenny's death is the occasion to try to reconstruct something, is a very Kyle act. Even in the bad future, even after 40 years of isolation, he's the one who sees the moment and tries to use it for something good. He doesn't succeed entirely, but he tries. There's something worth pausing on about Kyle's family in the bad future too, which is that it exists and appears functional. He has children. He has a home. Unlike Stan, who has retreated entirely into solitary professional life, Kyle built something. He didn't disappear. He stayed visible, stayed present in at least some community, stayed connected to South Park enough that when Kenny died, it made sense to him to reach out and try to bring people together. That quality, the staying, the presence, the refusal to disappear even when everything got difficult, is very Kyle. He didn't protect himself by withdrawing. He stayed out in the open where things could still hurt him, still fighting, still caring, too much, still being the person who makes the call. Combative and pessimistic, yes, but still there. And in the good future, that same quality, the staying, the presence, the caring, is what makes the Christmas party possible. Kyle was always going to be the one who called Stan. The good timeline is the one where Stan had something worth coming back to when he did. Right. So, Eric Cartman is a rabbi. I'll let that sit for a moment. In the bad future, the original unaltered timeline, the one that actually happened before Kenny went back and changed things, Eric Cartman has converted to Judaism, been ordained as a rabbi, and is living in Colorado Springs with his wife Yentl and their children. He is, by all observable evidence, a genuinely devout Jewish man. He delivers eulogies at funerals. He attends Kenny's wake without prompting and takes over when the event needs someone to hold it together. He whispers passages from the Torah to his wife in the middle of the night. He hugs his children when they need comforting. He seems, by every measure available to us, genuinely at peace with who he is. Kyle doesn't buy it for a single second, not one. Kyle's position the moment Cartman turns up at Kenny's wake, dressed in traditional religious clothing, calm, with the specific, settled quality of someone who has made peace with something important, is that this is the most elaborate con in the history of human relationships. That Cartman has been playing at being a rabbi for 40 years specifically, and only to torment him. And Kyle makes this case with absolute conviction, even watching Cartman embrace his children as they leave. Even watching Cartman hold his wife's hand in a quiet gesture that looks entirely natural. Even as Cartman's children, who are perfectly normal children, call Kyle by name and express the reasonable opinion that he is quite a lot. And the show, to its very considerable credit, never tells us whether Kyle is right. That ambiguity isn't a failure of nerve on the writer's part. I think it's the most honest thing the specials do, because the question of whether Cartman genuinely changed is, when you've spent 25 years with him, genuinely unanswerable. Not because the show is hiding something, but because Cartman has always existed in the space between what he actually is and what he performs. And those two things have never been neatly separable. The show built an entire character on the impossibility of knowing where the act ends and the person begins. Here is what we can observe. Cartman and Kenny stayed in contact throughout the bad years when the friendship between the boys completely dissolved. When Stan had retreated to his flat and his whiskey consulting, and Kyle had become combative and isolated, Cartman and Kenny maintained a relationship significant enough that Kenny considered him worth keeping in the loop about his research. Kenny's letter after his death implies that Cartman was someone Kenny trusted. Not as a research partner perhaps, but as someone still present, still reachable. Cartman turned up to the funeral. He took over the eulogy when the chaos of the new COVID variant announcement sent the congregation into a panic. Calmly, without drama, with the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to being the person who holds a room together. He has a wife and children. His family uses Kyle's name with the comfortable familiarity of people who have heard it frequently in the context of fond exasperation. The night at the Broflovski residence is worth describing. Cartman's family ends up there when the military closes the roads. Kyle, lying awake, can hear Cartman through the wall. He's whispering to Yentl, stories from the Torah. Quiet, private, tender, and register. The kind of conversation you have with your spouse at midnight, not the kind you have for an audience. Kyle bursts in because he cannot process what he's hearing without making it make sense in the framework he has for Cartman. He accuses Cartman of being in the middle of something. Cartman looks at him with the specific, weary patience of a man who has had this conversation many times and stopped finding it interesting. What gets me about that scene is the quality of Cartman's tiredness. It's not the contemptuous performance of irritation he deployed as a child. That deliberate, entertaining cruelty. It's quieter. If you read it charitably, it looks like someone who genuinely moved past something, who has genuine peace with who he became, and who finds Kyle's inability to accept it sad rather than infuriating, like watching someone still fighting a war that ended while they weren't paying attention. If you read it uncharitably, it looks like a very good actor who has had 40 years to perfect the performance. The show offers both readings with equal apparent sincerity. That's the point. Now, the other version. In the good future, the fixed timeline where Kenny's intervention worked and the friendship survived the pandemic, Cartman is homeless. He's across the street from the Christmas party shouting obscenities at the night. Butters notes plainly and without much sentiment that they can't spend another holiday trying to help him. His path was impossible to change. That contrast is one of the most structurally interesting choices in the specials. And I've spent more time on it than is probably reasonable. The simplest reading is this. In the bad future, catastrophe and isolation broke Cartman open, and something better got in through the cracks. He lost the friendship. He lost the specific comfort of having an audience who had always enabled his worst behaviors, who indulged him and feared him and reacted to him in all the ways that kept the persona fed. Stripped of that scaffolding, alone in the pandemic years, facing who he was without witnesses, he found something in Jewish philosophy and practice that actually resonated. The specific framework of it, the ethics, the ritual, the community, the long tradition of examining how you ought to live, suited something in him that the show had always hinted at underneath all the noise. In the good future, he never had to face that. The friendship survived. Things were relatively fine. He had his group, his comfort zone, his audience. Without the crisis that forced genuine reckoning with who he was, he just coasted. And coasting, for Eric Cartman, eventually leads to a street corner across from a Christmas party shouting at no one in particular. The show is not saying the bad timeline was good. It is not endorsing catastrophe as a character development strategy. But it is doing something more uncomfortable than a simple good-bad moral. It's suggesting that for a particular kind of person, genuine growth required everything to fall apart first. And the version of the timeline that went better didn't give him the chance. Whether that makes you feel something for him probably depends on how much of the preceding 25 seasons you're prepared to set aside. Personally, I find I can hold both things at once. The full awareness of what Cartman has been and a genuine openness to the possibility that Rabbi Cartman is real. The show earned both responses. It's asking you to sit in the uncertainty and sitting with it a bit longer, because I think this particular future deserves it. What strikes me most is the specific religion the show chose for Cartman's conversion. It's not a coincidence that it's Judaism. The show has, across 25 years, built an enormous amount of comedy on Cartman's anti-Semitism, on his specific and elaborate cruelty toward Kyle for being Jewish, on the way he deployed that particular prejudice with more creativity and more sustained commitment than almost anything else he did. Judaism is a thing Cartman spent his childhood using as a weapon. Converting to it is, depending on how you read it, either the most elaborate possible act of trolling or the most honest possible act of contrition. The show won't tell you which. That's the whole joke and the whole not joke simultaneously. There's also the specific detail of his wife's name, Yentl, which is the title of a 1983 Barbra Streisand film. And Barbra Streisand famously is the subject of one of South Park's earliest and most memorable episodes, in which she becomes a giant monster called Mecha Streisand and has to be defeated by a combination of Robert Smith and Leonard Maltin. Streisand has been throughout the show's history a recurring object of mockery, the first big target in the show's tradition of celebrity satire. And Cartman's devoutly Jewish wife is named after a Streisand film. Is that intentional? Is that a joke? Is it the show very quietly winking at you over Cartman's shoulder, suggesting that something here isn't quite right? Or is it just a normal Jewish name and the Streisand connection is a coincidence? I've been thinking about this for longer than I should, and I genuinely cannot tell, which is, again, the exact state the show wants you to be in regarding adult Cartman. The name Yentl comes from Yiddish. It means noble or gentle, and is also the title of the Streisand film and a Bashevis singer story about a woman who disguises herself as a man to pursue religious education. The story is, at its heart, about someone who wants access to something they're officially excluded from, who creates an elaborate alternate persona in order to get it, someone performing an identity to gain something they genuinely want. I'm not suggesting the show intended us to read Cartman's marriage through the lens of a Yiddish-American literary tradition. I'm just saying that if you wanted to construct a reading where Rabbi Cartman is an elaborate performance of an identity he created to get access to something he genuinely wanted, community, structure, belonging, the specific texture of a life with meaning, then even the name of his wife is doing work in that reading. And if you wanted to construct a reading where it's all completely genuine and Cartman simply married a woman named Yentl because that's her name and he loves her, that reading holds too. That's the whole Cartman future in miniature. Both readings hold. The show won't choose, no notes. Moving on. Let me talk about Kenny properly for a bit because his future is the one I keep coming back to. And to get there, you have to start with the curse, because without it, the adult version of Kenny doesn't make complete sense. For most of South Park's run, Kenny dying was a joke, a reliable, creative, often very funny joke. The methods were inventive, the timing was good, the Stan and Kyle response was a satisfying little ritual. But a joke. He'd get hit by something, or crushed, or struck by lightning, or spontaneously combust. Stan would say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle would call someone a bastard. And then next week, Kenny would just be there at the bus stop again, alive, and nobody would mention it. This ran for years. It was part of the show's DNA, like Randy doing something catastrophically irresponsible, or Cartman finding increasingly creative ways to be awful. Kenny dies. That's his thing. It doesn't need explaining. Then, somewhere around season 14, the show decided to take it seriously. The pivot comes through Mysterian, Kenny's superhero identity in the Coon and Friends storyline. When the boys form a superhero group, each of them picks a persona and a power. Most of them are clearly just kids in costumes performing at heroism. Kenny, as Mysterian, is different. He takes it with a gravity that the others don't understand. And the reason becomes clear when he explains, plainly and without theatrics, that his power is that he cannot die. He's been killed many times. He always comes back. Nobody ever remembers. His friends don't believe him. They think he's exaggerating. So Kenny, standing right in front of them, takes out a gun and shoots himself in the head. The room erupts. His friends are horrified. And the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his bed, alive. He goes to school, his friends are there, and not one of them has any memory of what happened. The emotional weight of that sequence is genuinely staggering for a show built on shock humor and celebrity mockery. Here is a child who dies repeatedly, who comes back to life repeatedly, and who is completely alone in the knowledge of it. Nobody believes him, nobody remembers. He carries it every time in total isolation with no resolution available. Then the show goes further and explains where it comes from. Kenny confronts his parents, Stuart and Carol McCormick, who have always been presented as chaotically neglectful in the comic strip way of South Park parents. And they admit that yes, they did attend a cult meeting once, a Cthulhu cult, a gathering dedicated to the ancient cosmic entity from H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, which is not where I expected this particular explanation to go when the show started building toward it. Why did they go? Free beer. Kenny's parents condemned their son to an eternity of dying and being reborn because they wanted a free evening, and there was free beer on offer. The most Lovecraftian cosmic horror the show could construct, triggered by the most mundane human motivation imaginable. There's a moment near the end of the relevant storyline that I think about more than I probably should. Kenny dies again, he's reborn again, his friends have forgotten again. And so, exhausted and alone with this knowledge, he tells them he's tired and wants to go home, shoots himself, and the scene cuts to his mother jolting awake in the night, clutching her stomach. In the next shot, she's placing a tiny baby in a crib, a baby in a small orange parka. And she says to her husband with genuine and quiet regret, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." That line recontextualizes everything. Every death played for laughs gets a different quality once you've heard it. He was always alone in it, not just a punchline, a child carrying a private nightmare that nobody around him could perceive, which makes what the bad future Kenny did with his adult life feel genuinely significant. Dr. Kenny McCormick, scientist, millionaire philanthropist, famous enough that when he dies, news programs run extended pieces about his research and his legacy. And Jimmy Valmer in New York drops everything to fly back to South Park for the funeral. He achieved something in the world, several things apparently. He built a public identity as a brilliant eccentric with resources and a specific, relentless focus. And he pointed all of it at one problem: time travel, specifically how to go back to the moment before the friendship between Stan, Kyle, and Cartman fell apart and prevent it from happening. He has a secret laboratory hidden in the science wing of South Park Elementary Plus. It's splattered in blood when the others find it. The occupational hazard of operating a time machine, apparently, and full of years of research. His notes name a man called Victor Chaos as a right-hand collaborator. His equations contain references to Tegrity Weed, which is what eventually leads Stan back to his father. Kenny knew who was responsible for the bad future. He said so clearly and without sentimentality in the video he left behind. It was his 3 dickhead friends, Stan, Kyle, and Cartman. Not because they were evil, not because they did anything dramatically terrible, just because they let the friendship die. They became combative and pessimistic and stopped cutting each other the slack that long friendships require. And the downstream consequences of 3 people no longer being held together made everything worse for everyone around them. Kenny spent 40 years trying to fix that. He couldn't have started the pandemic. He didn't do anything to cause the bad future. He was just there when it broke. And unlike the others, he didn't let himself break with it. The video itself, in true South Park fashion, is stored inside his corpse and can only be accessed by putting your hand inside his body in a very specific and undignified way. The boys argue in the morgue about whose job this is. Stan eventually agrees, saying he always has to fix everything, which is both funny and exactly true. The video shows Kenny explaining what he's been working on, blaming his friends with obvious and genuine affection, and then showing himself completing the time travel before the machine kills all his laboratory assistants, and he quietly leaves. He blamed them, he loved them, he spent his entire adult life on them. The COVID variant named after him, the Kenny McCormick, delivered by a news anchor with the gravity normally reserved for a serious development, is both funny and somehow appropriate. Of course, there's a variant named after Kenny McCormick. Of course, the immortal kid ended up with a disease named after him. The universe has maintained a very specific relationship with Kenny for 25 years, and it has never been kind. In the good future, the fixed timeline, the Christmas party at Denny's Applebee's Max, Kenny turns up, alive, fine, present, and he won a Nobel Prize, specifically for combining dark matter with breast implants. I've genuinely tried to work out what combining dark matter with breast implants could produce that would be Nobel-worthy. I don't have a satisfying answer. What I have is a strong conviction that this is exactly the right Nobel Prize for Kenny McCormick to win. It's absurd and specific and somehow completely him. It captures both his scientific ambition and the show's complete inability to treat anything entirely seriously. He combined dark matter with breast implants. The Nobel Committee thought this was significant enough to merit the prize. Good for them. He's alive. He's there. He won. For a character who died in nearly every episode for years, who carried a lonely cosmic curse that nobody acknowledged, who spent his adult life in the bad future working on a problem that wasn't his fault to solve. Being alive is the ending, just that, present, wearing his orange parka at a Christmas party in Colorado, having fixed the thing. And the show's choice to not make a huge moment of Kenny's arrival in the good future is, I think, the right one. He doesn't arrive to fanfare. There's no speech about what Kenny McCormick sacrificed. He's just there, and the party continues. That restraint, letting it be quiet and present rather than announced, feels like the show at its best. The immortal kid finally got to stay. And there's one more thing worth saying about Kenny's future before moving on. In both timelines, the bad one and the good one, Kenny is the most morally coherent person in the room. In the bad timeline, he's the one who stayed loyal when everyone else retreated, who devoted his resources to fixing something rather than managing his own comfort. In the good timeline, he's the one who shows up to the party alive and apparently untroubled, wearing his Nobel Prize lightly, not asking anyone to acknowledge what it cost. He doesn't make speeches about it. He doesn't need to be thanked. He's just there. That quality, doing the right thing without requiring recognition for it, is something the show has given Kenny in flashes throughout its run, usually buried under the joke of his deaths. He was always the one who sacrificed himself in the movie. He was always the one who, in the Coon and Friends storyline, went to the darkest place the plot required without making it anyone else's burden. The bad future version of him just took that quality and gave it a lifetime to operate. Of all the futures the post-COVID specials reveal, Kenny's is the one that feels most like the show settling a debt it didn't realize it owed. And I want to spend just a moment on the specific texture of what Kenny's bad future life must have looked like. Because the specials don't show us this directly, but you can infer quite a lot from the details around it. He became famous enough that major news organizations ran extended pieces about him on his death. Jimmy Valmer heard the name and immediately booked a flight. Stan, in his flat, recognizes him in a news clip. This suggests a public profile of some substance, not just a successful scientist, but someone whose work was considered newsworthy and whose death was genuinely felt in the wider world. The millionaire philanthropist descriptor implies not just wealth, but generosity with it, resources deployed for public benefit rather than personal accumulation. And yet all of that was fundamentally scaffolding. The public career, the scientific work, the philanthropy. It was all organized around one private project in a secret laboratory in the science wing of a school. He built a life that looked successful from the outside, and that probably was successful from the outside. And then he used the resources it gave him to try to fix a friendship that everyone else had long since written off. That's a portrait of a man who never quite left South Park, no matter how far he physically went. He carried the town with him. He carried the friendship with him. He became Dr. Kenny McCormick, eccentric scientist and public figure. And underneath all of that, he was still Kenny, still in his orange parka, still trying to make sure his 3 dickhead friends found their way back to each other. There's something that resonates with me about that kind of life. The public self that is entirely real and entirely successful, built alongside a private mission that nobody else knows about. Most people who maintain something like that for 40 years end up either abandon the private mission or destroyed by the gap between the two. Kenny managed to hold both, apparently, until the time machine killed him. Which honestly is very Kenny. He held the thing together until the very end, and then he died again, and then it worked anyway. Jimmy Valmer's future is, of the whole cast, probably the most narratively satisfying in the most uncomplicated way. And there's something I appreciate about that. In a set of specials full of broken families and burned farms and scientists who dedicated their lives to time machines, Jimmy's future is, he did what he said he was going to do. He hosts a late-night show, Late Night with Jimmy, taping from New York's Moderna Center, which is its own quiet piece of world building, a major entertainment venue named after a vaccine manufacturer, suggesting the pandemic has embedded itself into the cultural infrastructure of the future in ways both practical and a bit strange. Jimmy is there, in production, when the news comes through that Kenny has died. He stops filming, he books a flight to South Park. The combination of those two things offer the show that he built and the immediate choice to drop it when his friend's funeral called him elsewhere tells you everything about who Jimmy is in the future. He built the career, he got the show, and when it mattered to be somewhere else, he closed the show and went. For most of South Park's run, Jimmy cycled in and out of the ensemble as required. He wasn't a main character in the traditional sense, but when he was present, the show treated him with a consistent specificity that I think doesn't get enough credit. Jimmy wants to be a stand-up comedian. He has a stutter. The show could have made the relationship between those two things a redemption arc. The stutter as the obstacle, the career as the triumph over it. But it largely didn't. Jimmy pursues comedy because he loves it, and the stutter is part of how he sounds when he performs. And neither of those things is asked to be a metaphor for the other. He just works at it because it's what he wants to do. And he keeps working at it, and the world eventually gave him what he was working toward. The show occasionally used his disability carelessly in the way that South Park sometimes uses everything carelessly. But at its best, the writing respected both things about Jimmy. That he had a disability with real practical implications, and that he was a person with a specific vocation who was going to pursue it regardless of what the implications were. In the bad future, he's the natural host of Kenny's wake. Of course he is. Jimmy has always had a social intelligence that the show underlays. He reads rooms, he knows when to push and when to step back. He can manage a gathering of complicated, grieving people because he's been handling audiences his whole life. In The Good Future, his comedy in the future is described as politically incorrect, in a way that the people around him clearly appreciate. The show's framing suggests that whatever policing of comedy happened in the intervening decades, Jimmy continued doing what he was going to do regardless, because he was never someone who performed to an audience's expectations rather than his own. From open mic nights in South Park to Late Night with Jimmy from the Moderna Center in New York, he just kept going. The future for Jimmy is the work paid off, the loyalty held, and he came home when it mattered. Not everyone's future has to be complicated. Sometimes the most satisfying thing is watching someone do exactly what they always said they'd do. Since we're talking about Jimmy, it's worth mentioning one of the more interesting things the show did with his disability in the context of his comedy career, which is that it never resolved the stutter as a barrier. Jimmy didn't overcome it, he didn't train it away or find a technical workaround that made it invisible. He just incorporated it. The stutter is part of how Jimmy Valmer sounds when he tells a joke, and the audience gets to decide whether that's charming or distracting. And apparently, over 40 years of professional comedy, enough audiences decided it was charming that he ended up with a late-night show. That's the career arc, not triumph over obstacle, but persistence through it, which is a different and arguably more honest story. The Moderna Center detail is one I keep coming back to, actually, because it says something about the specific world the show built in those specials. Vaccine manufacturers naming concert halls and entertainment centers is a very plausible extrapolation of the kind of institutional branding creep that's been happening for decades in the real world. Stadiums named after banks and airlines, hospitals named after pharmaceutical companies. Of course, a major entertainment venue in the future is named after a vaccine manufacturer. Of course, Jimmy Valmer tapes his late-night show there. The future is just the present with the volume turned up slightly. Tolken Black arrives in the post-COVID specials with a badge and a measure of quiet authority. And the image of him flashing that badge is one of those small details that lands better the more time you've spent with the show. He works in law enforcement. He and Kyle were the ones who maintained contact with Kenny throughout the bad years. The ones who took Kenny's research seriously when others had moved on, who kept the thread alive. When the situation needs someone steady, Tolken is there, badge out, doing the work. It suits him. Throughout South Park's run, Tolken, who the show spent years calling Token, a self-aware joke about the casting of the sole black kid in a mostly white ensemble, before eventually and fairly earnestly retconning his name as a genuine tribute to J.R.R. Tolkien, has been at his best the grounded one. The character who calls things what they are, the straight man in a cast that is perpetually in various states of chaos. The Tolkien versus Token storyline from a few seasons back is worth a brief mention because it's one of the more genuinely earnest things recent South Park has done, which is not always a compliment, but in this case mostly is. Stan discovers that he'd spent years thinking his friend's name was Token, a racial commentary joke a bit, and that literally everyone else in his life had always known it was Tolkien after the author. The discomfort of Stan's mistake, and his well-meaning but thoroughly fumbled attempts to address it, was played with more sensitivity than the show usually manages. It didn't resolve cleanly, it didn't tie up in a punchline, it just sat there, somewhat awkwardly and honestly, the way these things do. Tolkien's response to Stan's embarrassment, coming over to check on him, offering the grounded and human moment, is very Tolkien. He's the one who provides the grace note, the one who sees that someone is struggling and makes himself present. Law enforcement, for someone with those qualities, makes intuitive sense. It's methodical. It rewards calling things by their right names and following evidence rather than emotional interpretation. It requires showing up consistently rather than dramatically. Tolkien's future isn't the most spectacular in the specials. No Nobel Prize, no late-night show, no decades-long time travel project. But it says something clear and consistent about who he has always been. And in a cast where several characters become significantly less recognizable versions of themselves under the pressure of their futures, that consistency feels valuable. He showed up. He had a badge. He helped figure out what happened to Kenny. Sometimes that's the future. There's a broader pattern worth noting in Tolkien's future, which is that the characters in the post-COVID specials who seem most intact as people, most recognizably themselves, most clearly okay, are the ones who built something solid and practical. Jimmy built a TV career. Tolkien built a law enforcement career. Tweak and Craig built a relationship. Butters built a management position at Applebee's. The characters who suffered most in the bad future are the ones who either built nothing, Stan retreating into his flat, or built something that was more about self-image than substance. Randy with his farm and his integrity. Tolkien's future is solid in the most fundamental sense. It's real, it's his, and it doesn't depend on anyone else's tragedy to exist. And there's one more detail about Tolkien's future that I think is worth mentioning, which is the specific role he plays in the bad future investigation. He and Kyle are the ones who had remained connected to Kenny. They're the ones who knew enough to keep the thread going when everyone else had dropped it. When Stan comes back to South Park and the group starts trying to work out what happened to Kenny, Tolkien is already there, badge out, ahead of the others. That's not accidental. Tolkien has always been, underneath the relatively limited screen time, the character with the clearest sense of what's actually happening in a given situation. He's not the most vocal, he's not the most dramatic, he's just the one who tends to know what's going on. In The Bad Future, that quality translated into a career that requires exactly that. Showing up, paying attention, following where the evidence leads, and it kept him connected to the people who mattered when the rest of the group scattered. He was already there. He already knew. That's exactly the right future for Tolkien Black. Wendy and Stan have one of the longer romantic through lines in the show's history, which is a strange thing to say about a relationship between animated 9-year-olds, and yet here we are. They got together in the first season, they broke up, they got back together. She dated a French exchange student named Gregory and kissed him in front of Stan. Stan threw up on her the first time he ever tried to talk to her in the pilot, which is either an inauspicious beginning or a very honest one. They went to prom together. They argued. They circled each other across 20-plus seasons with the specific energy of two people who haven't quite decided whether they're done and keep not quite deciding. The Bad Future resolves this by marrying her to someone named Darwin. Darwin. I have thought about this name. It's either a coincidence, a joke, or both, which is usually where South Park lands on things. A joke about natural selection, perhaps. The partner who survived the process of elimination, or just a funny name. She's been with Darwin long enough that nobody at Kenny's funeral makes anything of it. They arrive together, as established couples do, and she talks to the others with the warmth of someone who came back because these people mattered to her, not because she had unresolved things with any of them. The show doesn't dwell on the Stan-Wendy history in The Bad Future, and I think that reticence is the point. In the timeline where the friendship collapsed and Stan retreated into isolation, the specific thread between him and Wendy simply didn't have what it needed to keep returning to itself. Their relationship, at its best, worked in the low-key register. Two people who understood each other without needing to perform the understanding, who kept gravitating toward each other even through the gaps. Without the supporting world around them, the gravitational pull wasn't strong enough. The good future is different. Wendy comes back from Harvard. She went to Harvard, which tracks entirely for the character who was consistently the most academically serious and politically engaged person in her class. And she seeks Stan out at the Christmas party to promise that they'll spend New Year's together. Not a grand romantic declaration, not a dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet commitment to see each other again, to keep the thread. I think the show made the right call giving them that ending rather than something more dramatic. The Wendy and Stan relationship has always worked best in its lower register. The ease of two people who know each other well, the way they kept coming back to each other without requiring the drama to feel real. She went to Harvard, she came back, she found Stan at the party and made a plan. In 40 years of television, that's the version. And I think it's worth saying something about what the show communicated with the Harvard detail specifically. Wendy going to Harvard is the good future's way of telling you that she thrived. She took the intellectual seriousness and the political engagement that defined her as a child and gave it the best possible institutional home and made something of it. We don't know what she studied or what career she built. The specials don't tell us. But the Harvard detail functions as a shorthand for she did well, in the same way that Kenny's Nobel Prize functions as a shorthand for the same thing. The show didn't need to give us the specifics, it just needed to tell us that the futures these characters got in the good timeline were good ones, with enough detail to feel real. Wendy in The Bad Future, married to Darwin, at Kenny's wake, changed by the pandemic like everyone else, is doing fine too by the evidence. She came, she engaged with the others, she seemed, for all practical purposes, like a person who built a life. It's just that the life she built doesn't include Stan, and the good future puts Stan back in it. Not because the show is making a statement about romantic destiny or soulmates or any of that, just because in the timeline where things went better, these two people stayed connected enough to find their way back to each other, which is honestly how most of the good future outcomes work. They're not magical, they're just the result of people not losing each other. Tweak and Craig Tucker are still a couple. 40 years later, they flew in together for the funeral. That's really the whole section, in the best possible way. For the context, Tweak and Craig becoming a couple started as a meta joke, in one of those moments where South Park found the gap between its own world and its fan community and decided to walk directly into it. The show's writers had discovered that a significant body of yaoi fan fiction, a Japanese artistic tradition of romantic stories featuring male characters, which had migrated enthusiastically into Western cartoon fandom by the mid-2000s, had been pairing Tweak and Craig. The show did an episode that engaged with this directly. A group of Japanese exchange students begins producing elaborate romantic fan art depicting the two boys as a couple, and the town absorbs this as established fact. Teachers treat it as real. Their parents hold them to it. Everyone around them acts as though this has been decided. Both boys are initially baffled and resistant. They insist they're not actually a couple, that this is all a misunderstanding, that the fan art doesn't represent anything real. And then, slowly, something shifts. There's a scene near the end where they're doing a couples performance and they argue backstage about whether any of it is real. Something in the argument, some quality of the frustration, some recognition of what they've been doing over the previous weeks and why they kept doing it, tips them both toward the same conclusion quietly and separately. The show doesn't announce it, it just lets them arrive there and then they're together. They've been together since, in the show's continuity. Episodes in subsequent seasons show them in the background as a couple, give them small moments and arguments and the ordinary maintenance of a relationship that's lasted long enough to have both ease and occasional friction. 40 years later, they arrived at the funeral together. Both changed by the pandemic years like everyone else. Both from out of town. Still, after everything, a couple. The show makes no particular moment of this. They're just there, together, as people who have been together for a very long time tend to be. I find this the most quietly satisfying future of any character in the specials, not because it's the most eventful, it clearly isn't, but because it says something about a particular kind of relationship. The kind that started improbably, that survived because it was genuinely compatible underneath all the surface noise, that doesn't require constant dramatic intervention because the foundation is solid enough not to need it. Tweak is anxious and high-strung, and Craig is measured and slightly detached, and that combination apparently works, has been working for 4 decades. Sometimes the best possible future for a character is exactly what you'd hope for, and nothing more complicated than that. What I find interesting about Tweak and Craig's future in the broader context of the specials is what it says by contrast. Stan and Kyle's friendship fell apart. Stan and Wendy's relationship didn't survive the bad timeline. Randy's marriage ended catastrophically. Kenny spent 40 years alone working on a machine. And through all of that, in the middle of all that loss and distance and separation, Tweak and Craig just stayed. The show doesn't explain why. It doesn't give us a scene from their pandemic years, a moment of difficulty that they came through together, an articulation of how they managed to maintain the relationship when so much else was breaking. There's a specific dynamic between Tweak and Craig that I think explains their durability, even if the show never explains it directly. Tweak is the kind of person who needs to be held by someone solid. His anxiety is constant, his sense of threat is overactive, his default state is barely managed panic. Craig is not comforting in any conventional sense. He's not warm, he's not demonstratively affectionate, he's not the person who says the right thing at the right moment. What he is steady, reliably present, not going anywhere. For someone like Tweak, that steadiness is everything. The right person for him wasn't someone who matched his energy or talked him down from every spiral, but someone who simply continued to be there through all of them without treating them as a burden. Craig is that person. He appears to have always been that person. And what Craig gets from the relationship, what the show has occasionally let us see in the moments where he drops the detached, slightly contemptuous demeanor he usually projects, is someone who is genuinely, unreservedly, transparently pleased to be with him. Tweak doesn't play it cool. He never has. He brings his whole self to everything he does, and the whole self is anxious and loud and very obviously attached. For someone like Craig, who has spent his entire childhood performing indifference, being loved by someone who can't pretend not to love you is probably the most grounding thing in the world. 40 years later, still together, of course they are. Butters has two futures in the post-COVID specials, and the distance between them is one of the more interesting contrasts in either film. Let's start with the better one. In the good timeline, Butters works at Denny's Applebee's Max, the future restaurant chain that appears to have emerged from several corporate mergers, and he's just been promoted to manager. He announces this at the Christmas party with genuine, unironic delight. He's proud of it. He wants people to know. And then, almost immediately, he's the one who says plainly that they can't spend another holiday trying to help Cartman. His path was impossible to change. Both things in the same moment, the small triumph of the promotion and the quiet authority of someone who has worked out where the limits are. Understanding what makes this future feel right for Butters requires spending a moment on who Butters has been throughout the show. Butters Stoch is, across 20-odd years of South Park, the character most consistently used as a prop in other people's schemes. He gets grounded by his parents for things he didn't do. He's blamed for outcomes that were never quite his fault. He's brought in as an accomplice to whatever Cartman is currently planning and then dropped when he stops being useful. He was once used as a human puppet. He spent an episode believing he had become a vampire. His parents, Linda and Steven Stoch, love him in their particular way, but their parenting has always had the quality of people who treat their child as a manageable variable rather than a person with his own inner life. And through all of it, Butters has remained fundamentally decent. Warmly, somewhat naively, genuinely decent. He thinks well of people, he forgives easily, he's quick to apologize and quick to help. He is, when you look at him clearly, one of the few characters in the entire cast who is consistently trying his honest best, even when the world around him is doing everything it can to train that quality out of him. But he also has, sitting underneath all the warmth, a frustrated need to be taken seriously, to matter, to be seen as more than the kid who gets used and forgotten. And it's from that frustrated need that Professor Chaos was born. Professor Chaos, Butters' supervillain alter ego, created when he was temporarily expelled from the group and decided that if he couldn't be accepted, he would become evil instead, is magnificent in its specificity. He made himself a green cape and a metal helmet. His schemes for world domination included flooding the earth with a garden hose, switching everyone's meal orders at a restaurant, and creating a second sun by putting a reflective panel in orbit. He was, as supervillains go, profoundly unscary. He was foiled consistently and easily. He was completely committed to the project regardless. The persona mattered to him because it gave him somewhere to put the part of himself that couldn't get respect through normal channels. He couldn't be taken seriously as Butters Stoch. He could, at least in his own head, be taken seriously as Professor Chaos. In the bad future, that persona didn't stay contained. A character referred to as Victor Chaos, the name pronounced Chowshi by the institutional staff, which is its own perfect detail. The villain name, slightly mispronounced by the facility holding him, is kept at the South Park Mental Asylum Plus. He can't take phone calls. Visitors require all members of the visiting party to be vaccinated. He has been receiving mysterious calls that the warden finds both notable and confusing. Victor Chaos is Butters. We aren't told this directly, but the implication is clear enough. Professor Chaos, over 40 years without the stabilizing presence of whatever passed for community in the bad timeline, became something that required institutionalization. The show deliberately doesn't tell us the specifics, what Victor Chaos did, what the calls are about, what he's planning, if anything. It drops the information, the name, the asylum, the mysterious calls, and then moves on, which is a specific kind of storytelling choice. Here's a wait. We're not explaining it, but you can feel it. What I find most interesting about the contrast between the two Butters futures isn't just the good versus bad comparison. It's that both versions are recognizably him. The one who became a restaurant manager took his warmth and his need to be useful and his fundamental decency and found an institution that valued all of those things and gave him room to grow. The one who became Victor Chaos took his frustrated need for recognition and his capacity for elaborate planning and his resentment at being consistently overlooked. And those things went where they went without anything to redirect them. Neither version is unrecognizable from the child. They both grew from the same roots. The difference between them is probably the presence or absence of people who saw Butters as someone rather than something. Manager at Applebee's or supervillain in a mental asylum. Both of them feel true. And there's one more thing about the good future Butters that I want to pull on, which is the moment where he sets the limit on helping Cartman. We can't spend another holiday trying to help Cartman. His path was impossible to change. The show gives that line to Butters specifically, and not to Kyle or Stan or Randy, and I think that choice is deliberate. Kyle would say it with frustration, as a statement of outrage, as a moral argument. Stan would say it reluctantly, as a practical conclusion he'd rather not have reached. Randy would probably say it while somehow making it about himself. But Butters says it with a specific kind of settled sadness. He's tried. They've all tried. Some things you can change and some things you can't. And he's worked out which is which. The man who was always the most forgiving, the most easily talked into one more attempt, the one who assumed the best about people even after those people had repeatedly demonstrated they didn't deserve it. That man is the one who finally, in the good future, says enough. That's its own kind of growth. And it required the good future to happen. In the bad timeline, with the friendship broken and Butters possibly in a mental asylum, nobody is at the Christmas party setting limits. Nobody is doing the quiet, emotional work of deciding what they owe someone who won't meet them halfway. The good future is the one where Butters got to be Butters, warm and decent and slightly too trusting, long enough to learn gradually and on his own terms where the limit is. That feels like growing up. And before we leave Butters entirely, I want to sit with the Victor Chaos detail a moment longer because I think it deserves it. The show drops it into the specials so briefly and so casually that it's easy to let it slide past. But what it's really doing, naming Butters as the mentally institutionalized villain the other characters need to visit as part of their investigation into Kenny's death, is placing him right at the center of the plot's machinery in the bad timeline. Victor Chaos was apparently involved with Kenny's work in some capacity. His name appears in the research. He's receiving mysterious calls. The warden doesn't know what to make of him. He's clearly still active, still connected to whatever is happening, still the right-hand man in whatever Kenny was building. Which means that in the bad future, it's Butters. Of all the people who could have been Kenny's collaborator, the one who stayed connected to the project, the one who helped with the research, the one who's now locked in a mental facility still receiving classified calls. It's Butters, sweet, endlessly optimistic, chronically overlooked Butters, who became a supervillain as a child and apparently never entirely stopped. There's something almost satisfying about that. In a timeline where everything broke apart, where Stan became isolated and Kyle became combative and Randy lost everything, Butters found someone who needed him and committed to it completely. He helped Kenny with the work. He went wherever the work took him. He ended up in a mental asylum with mysterious callers and a name that gets mispronounced. He mattered to the project. He was never not going to matter in some version of events. Randy Marsh is probably the character whose bad future hits hardest, and not entirely because of what happened to him. It's because of what he did and the way he understands what he did and the gap between those two things. which is, it turns out, exactly as wide as it was when he was building his marijuana farm in the first place. The Tegrity Farms era, which dominated the show for several seasons from around season 22, transformed Randy from the chaotic but fundamentally benign side character he'd been for most of the show into something more central and more complicated. He moved his family to a farm, he started growing marijuana, he named it Tegrity, as in integrity, as in the value he most loudly claimed to embody. And he built an identity around it that went well beyond what the business required. He wore the overalls, he gave interviews, he told anyone who would listen about the values underpinning what he was building. He treated the farm less like a business and more like a calling. The Tegrity Farms era showed all the ways that self-delusion can be done at high volume and with complete conviction. Randy prioritized the farm over the family that had been dragged along to it. Sharon was unhappy. Shelley was unhappy. Stan, old enough to have an opinion, found the whole enterprise faintly ridiculous. Randy either didn't notice or had built a framework that didn't require him to notice. He was busy with something important. The bad future is where that tendency, the consistent choosing of the thing that embodies his self-image over the people who actually need him, runs to its natural endpoint. When Sharon wants a divorce, Randy refuses to give her half the farm, not because of a complex legal situation or financial necessity, because the farm is the thing he is. Giving half of it away feels like giving half of himself away. He holds the line, he chooses the farm. He loses Sharon in the most literal possible sense. Then Stan burns the farm down, and Shelley dies in it because Randy locked her in the barn as punishment for undone chores. And Sharon doesn't survive what comes after. Randy's account of all this, delivered at Shady Acres when Stan comes to see him, is both self-aware and completely insulated from genuine accountability. He traces the whole catastrophe back through an elaborate chain of external causes. Garrison's presidency, the pandemic, race wars, China deliberately weakening American optimism, the release of Space Jam 2. He builds this chain with the fluency of someone who has been constructing it for years, each link leading away from himself and towards some external force that used him. He also mentions, with the equanimity of a man who has processed a piece of information and filed it under things that happened to me, that he started the pandemic by sleeping with a pangolin, and that China used him to do this. He says it the same way you'd mention you once left your umbrella on a bus. The image of Randy at the burned ruins of Tegrity Farms, protective of a single surviving weed sprout, hallucinating Sharon and Shelley standing in the ashes, pointing at Stan, is one of the quieter pieces of characterization in the whole specials, not presented as a dramatic moment, not underlined, just there in the scene. A man with one small green thing in the wreckage of everything his choices destroyed, seeing the people he failed as accusations directed at his son. And then the good future. In the fixed timeline, Randy is at the Christmas party making the final toast. Sharon is beside him. Shelley is alive. He thanks everyone for making it through, and the assembled gathering, including an adult Timmy Birch, who walks in under his own power and speaks clearly, raises their glasses. The mechanism of the fix is very Randy, which I appreciate. The special strain of Tegrity weed he'd been developing for years, hidden away, apparently the key to something, gets distributed in the good timeline like a vaccine. People use it, they calm down, they extend grace to each other. The social fabric of South Park repairs itself, person by person, as the weed moves through the community. Randy saves everyone by giving away the thing he'd been hoarding, the thing that, in the bad timeline, he chose over his marriage and his family. In the good one, he shares it freely, and the sharing is what heals things. That's the show's version of Randy's redemption. Not a tearful character transformation, not a moment of apology and absolution, but the same essential Randy. The same instinct toward the grand gesture, the same capacity for genuine feeling underneath all the self-regard. redirected at exactly the right moment towards something generous rather than something possessive. He's still Randy. He still makes the final toast. He just used the thing he loves for something that actually helped. Whether he deserved the good ending is a fair question. He caused serious harm in the bad timeline and clearly understood at some level that he had. But I find I don't mind the show giving it to him. His complexity and the gap between who he claims to be and who he actually is, and the occasional moments when those two things temporarily align, is one of the more interesting things the show has produced. And seeing him with his family intact and his weed contributing something meaningful is the version of his story worth wanting. A last thought on Randy specifically. The show's final line about the good future. Weed can't solve all of your problems, but integrity can, is both a joke and not quite a joke, which is where South Park always lives most comfortably. Integrity is Randy's word for integrity, the thing he named his farm after and then spent several seasons spectacularly failing to embody. And in the good future, the integrity weed, the thing literally named after the value he most failed to demonstrate, is what heals the town. There's something in that about how the show understands redemption, or at least its version of it. Not as the demonstration that someone became a better person, not as the clean erasure of what they did before, but as the possibility that the thing you built, even when you built it for the wrong reasons and used it badly and nearly destroyed everyone around you in the process, might, given the right circumstances, do something genuinely good. Randy's farm, Randy's weed, Randy's whole integrity project. It was always flawed and often awful. In the good future, it just got one moment right. And that was enough. One more thing about Randy's bad future that I don't want to gloss over, which is Sharon. The show doesn't linger on what happened to Sharon in the bad timeline. It's mentioned by Randy and by Stan in the context of their confrontation at Shady Acres, and then it stays there. She's gone. She took her own life after losing Shelley. That's a fact the scene is built around, and the show handles it with more restraint than it handles almost anything else. What strikes me about that restraint is how much it respects Sharon specifically. Sharon Marsh has, across the show's run, often existed as the moderating presence who absorbs Randy's chaos. The one who objects, who sighs, who sometimes wins and sometimes doesn't, who stays. She's been a figure of mild comedy and also, in certain episodes, a figure of genuine feeling. There have been moments where the show let her be frustrated and exhausted and human in a way that went beyond the long-suffering wife template. She deserved better than the bad timeline gave her. The show doesn't pretend otherwise. It just says plainly, she's gone, and that's what the bad future cost. In the good future, she's beside Randy at the Christmas party. She's alive. She makes it. That's it. That's the whole good future Sharon. She's there. And somehow that's enough. There are a handful of other characters worth spending a little time with before we start winding down. People who don't get the full treatment of a major section, but whose futures are specific enough to deserve a few paragraphs each. Let's start with Scott Malkinson. Scott Malkinson became a priest. He delivers the eulogy at Kenny's funeral in South Park Church. He stands at the front and asks the congregation to reflect, to cherish friends and family, to consider what actually matters when you're sitting in a church saying goodbye to someone. He means it, he's earnest about it, he prepared his words. Nobody particularly acknowledges him. This is the thing about Scott Malkinson. He has always been, in South Park's ensemble, the character who is peripheral even when he's doing something perfectly reasonable. He was introduced as the kid with diabetes, a fact repeated with such casual persistence by the other characters that it became its own running joke. And he wanted, fairly consistently across his appearances, to be included, to matter, to be treated as someone worth paying attention to. Scott Malkinson, now a priest, delivering a thoughtful and sincere eulogy at the funeral of a friend, in a church full of people who are mostly paying attention to each other rather than to him. Rabbi Cartman takes over when the chaos starts. Nobody makes a particular point of the fact that Scott was doing a perfectly good job. He still presumably has diabetes. He now has a collar. He carries on. The show has a long tradition of giving characters exactly the future that makes perfect comedic sense for them, while also being somehow right. Jimmy becoming a comedian, Tweak and Craig staying together, Tolkien going into law enforcement. These futures all have a quality of course. Of the show reaching the conclusion that was always waiting at the end of the character's particular road. Scott Malkinson becoming a priest has that same quality. He was always the one who took things seriously when others didn't. He always showed up. He was always slightly overlooked while showing up. A priest is someone who shows up for funerals, for weddings, for people in difficulty, for the quiet maintenance of meaning in a community. And is sometimes not particularly noticed while doing it. That's Scott. That's always been Scott. And he still has diabetes. Both things are true. He is a priest with diabetes and nobody particularly pays attention to him and he carries on regardless. And that is the most Scott Malkinson ending possible. PC Principal's future isn't in the post-COVID specials in any prominent way, but his present-day arc has run long enough to feel like a future in its own right. He came into the show in season 19 as an almost cartoonishly blunt satirical target. The living embodiment of campus culture politics, the human form of a specific kind of institutional progressivism that the show was clearly itching to skewer. He was broad, he was loud, he was designed to be easily mocked, and then the show kept him. Season after season, long past the point where most one-note satirical characters would have been retired. In keeping him, the writing gave him complexity. He had a relationship with Vice Principal Strong Woman, he had children, he had genuine moments of sincerity that didn't quite fit the satirical template. He became, over time, a character who was still satirizing something, but was also something more than the satire. His future in the specials, still at the school, still running things, still ordering lights out at 9 when the building becomes an emergency shelter, is the continuation of that arc. He found something in that institution that was worth staying for. Some people commit to things, even imperfect things, because the alternative is drifting, and PC Principal is constitutionally unable to drift. Clyde Donovan's future is one of the most perfectly in-character outcomes in either special, and it's very simple. Clyde is still unvaccinated. After 40 years of vaccine research, 40 years of medical and scientific consensus, and whatever horrors the pandemic variants managed in the intervening decades, Clyde has not had the jab. His reasoning involves a shellfish allergy and concerns about cross-contamination with shellfishness, which is not a real medical concern. He has a general feeling that it's a personal choice, and he has made that choice and he is not interested in revisiting it. The scene where Wendy, desperate to get everyone vaccinated so they can visit someone in the mental facility, pretends to be offering cocaine to try to trick Clyde, and Clyde still refuses once he realizes what's actually in the syringe. This is character writing of a very specific and satisfying kind. Clyde has decided. The form of the argument being made doesn't change what he's decided. He will remain Clyde, even more so, until the end. And then Timmy Birch, in The Good Future, the Christmas party, the fixed timeline, adult Timmy walks in and speaks clearly. He's not in his wheelchair, he just walks in. The show does not dwell on it. There's no speech about what it represents. The narrator notes it and moves on. This one gets me more than almost anything else in the specials, and I've thought about why. Timmy has been in the show since season 4 and has always occupied slightly complicated territory in the ensemble. The show treating him with varying degrees of thoughtfulness across the years, sometimes giving him genuine agency and storylines, sometimes using his disability as easy comedy. At his best, the writing treated him as a full person who happened to have both a disability and a wheelchair. At its worst, it coasted. Seeing him walk into the Good Future's Christmas party under his own power, speaking clearly, with no fanfare and no apology for the absence of a big moment about it, the show choosing to let it be quietly true rather than cinematically announced, feels like the most respectful thing it could have done with Timmy. In the world where things went better, Timmy got better too. And that's allowed to just be a fact of the party, unremarkable and present. A brief note on Ike Broflovski. Kyle's younger Canadian-born adopted brother appears in a post-credits scene after the original South Park movie, eating a rat in an attic while waiting for his mother to come back. This is much earlier than the post-COVID specials, but it establishes something that the later show somewhat confirms. Ike adapts, Ike persists, Ike will be fine eventually, even in attics, even with rats. He's going to be okay. It's worth adding a brief note on the parents generally because their fate in the bad future is outlined fairly starkly in the specials. Most of the boys' parents, along with other adults from their childhood, have ended up at Shady Acres, the old folks' home where Stan goes to confront Randy. They're not allowed to leave. They receive visitors, sort of, though the rules are complicated by the ongoing pandemic restrictions. Gerald and Sheila Broflovski are presumably there. Stuart and Carol McCormick, who condemned their son to a cosmic curse for free beer, are presumably there. The image of the adults from the boys' childhood being gathered in this facility, together but contained, supervised by a system that neither quite cares for them nor quite lets them go, is one of the more melancholy background details in the specials. They were, for most of the show's run, figures of comedy. The parents who weren't paying attention, or who were paying the wrong kind of attention, or who made terrible decisions that their children had to live with. In the bad future, they've been moved somewhere they can be managed. The town they helped build has changed around them and they don't quite fit into it anymore. Nobody gets a particularly dignified ending in the bad timeline. Even the adults who weren't the architects of its worst disasters end up reduced and peripheral. That's the bad timeline's real message. Not just that specific people suffered, but that everything contracted. The possibilities shrank. Even the comedy figures ended up in a nursing home. It's worth taking a moment just to look at the town because the physical description of future South Park in the specials does some genuinely rich work. Stan's drive back into South Park in the bad future accomplishes the work of 100 lines of exposition. You watch him pass through the landscape and register the alterations one by one, each one a small calibration of how much has changed, and by the time he parks, you've built a fairly complete picture of a place that has been both preserved and transformed. Kenosha Pass is still there. The road still runs through the mountains the same way it always did. Some topography is too fundamental to change. But there are palm trees. This is the detail that hit me hardest. Palm trees growing in a mountain town in Colorado that spent most of its on-screen history buried under snow. The climate changed enough over 40 years that the visual signature of South Park, the gray skies, the white ground, the bleak December palette that defined the show aesthetically for decades, has been replaced with something warmer and stranger. Nobody comments on the palm trees. They're just there. They've presumably been there for a while. Stark's Pond, which appears in the background of dozens of episodes across the show's run, kids skating on it in winter, fishing around it in summer, having various adventures on its banks across every season, is nearly dried up. Not gone, almost gone. A shallow pool where there used to be a real body of water. This detail functions as a temporal marker more effectively than any calendar date could. That pond has been there since the show began. Watching it diminished in the bad future is watching the show's own history diminished. The Park County Police Station is closed, shuttered. The institution that spent most of the show's run being hilariously ineffective at its job has apparently stopped being ineffective in the most complete way available. Whether law enforcement consolidated elsewhere or simply ceased to function isn't specified. The building is there. It just doesn't operate. South Park Elementary is now South Park Elementary Plus. The plus branding suggests the kind of institutional expansion or rebranding that happens when something needs to justify its continued existence. Corporate reorganization, administrative restructuring. The word plus added to signal improvement without specifying what improved. The school is larger. It serves as an emergency shelter during the new outbreak, which says something about the dual-use repurposing of public institutions when the infrastructure changes around them. Denny's Applebee's Max is where Kyle and Stan first meet up. The corporate merger between Denny's and Applebee's has happened. The Max suffix in the tradition of streaming service rebrandings suggests either further consolidation or a premium tier. There's no meat on the menu. Sustainable insect protein only, explained by the waiter with the patience of someone who has been explaining it since the menu changed. The future's relationship to food is different. The future's relationship to branding is exactly the same, just with more syllables. What strikes me about the totality of these details, bark frame, the palm trees, the dried pond, the plus branding, the merged restaurant, the hoverboards, the dog optometry, is how thoroughly they replace without erasing. South Park still looks like South Park. You can still recognize it. But almost everything that made it distinctively itself has been altered in some way. The familiar structures are still there, but they've been updated, rebranded, partially replaced. The old names are gone. The old businesses are closed or absorbed. The town that hosted the show for 24 seasons exists in the bad future as a kind of palimpsest. The shape of South Park laid over by something that's technically still South Park but isn't quite the same thing anymore. That feels true to how real places change over time. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually, persistently, in ways that nobody planned and nobody quite stopped. The pond loses water, the restaurant merges with another restaurant, the school gets plus appended to its name, and one day you drive back and tell your Alexa you feel shitty, and you pass the landmarks you used to know and they're still there but different enough that the familiar feeling and the estranged feeling are happening simultaneously. Stan feels shitty driving back. The town is still the town. Both things are true. The familiar and the strange sitting right next to each other, which is probably the truest thing the show has ever accidentally said about what it means to go home after a long time away. Children on hoverboards, adults using VR dog optometry, which is a very specific new service to include, though presumably dogs always needed eye tests. These details accumulate to paint a picture of a world that has moved at roughly the pace the real world has been moving. Not the science fiction version of the future with flying cars and completely alien technology, but the recognizable continuation of current trends, a bit more advanced, a bit more specialized, a bit more merged. What stays with me is the pond. Stark's Pond is in the background of so much of what the show is. It's not a plot element. It's not symbolic in any deliberate sense. It's just there, across seasons and seasons of South Park, a constant in the visual world the show built. Nearly dried up in the bad future, nearly gone. That detail, the nearly empty pond, is the one I come back to when I think about what 40 years cost the bad timeline South Park. Not the burned farm, not the closed police station, not the palm trees, the pond, just less water than there used to be. The small losses add up. One thing the specials are clear about. The show's vision of future South Park is specifically a bad timeline future. The good timeline South Park isn't really shown to us in physical detail. We're mostly at the Christmas party inside Denny's Applebee's Max, which could look exactly the same in both timelines since the building presumably exists in both. We don't know if Stark's Pond is full again in the good future. We don't know if the police station reopened. We don't know if the palm trees are still there. And I think that's a deliberate choice. The specials aren't interested in showing us a utopian South Park where the climate healed and the institutions recovered and everything returned to the way it was. The good future is smaller than that. It's a Christmas party. It's the people being there. The town is still whatever it is. Still changed by 40 years, still bearing the marks of what happened. But the people in it are okay. They're together. That's the version of better that the show can offer. The bad timeline South Park, with its palm trees and its closed police station and its nearly empty pond, is what the town looks like when the people in it aren't okay. The physical environment becomes an extension of the emotional one. When the friendships broke, the town broke. When the community fragmented, the infrastructure that served the community stopped being maintained. It's not that the palm trees caused the sadness. It's that both the palm trees and the sadness are symptoms of the same underlying thing, a place that lost the people who used to hold it together. That's quite a thing for a show about cartoon children to say, but South Park has always been quite a thing. There's one more detail about the future town I want to mention before we move on: the food. Specifically the no-meat menu and the sustainable insect protein at Denny's Applebee's Max. This is the kind of detail that's very easy to read as a joke. And it is a joke, largely, but it also functions as a specific kind of future-proofing. The show is saying, by the time this takes place, the transition away from meat-based protein has happened. Not in a dramatic, utopian way, but in the mundane, corporate way that food transitions actually happen, where the restaurant chain just changes the menu and the waiter explains it with practice patience because he's been explaining it for years. Future food is insect protein. Future entertainment venues are named after vaccine companies. Future children use hoverboards. Future people talk to their Alexis as though they're companions. The world got weirder in specifically the ways you'd expect it to get weirder given the trends that already existed, which is, I think, the most honest way to write the future. And there's something almost reassuring in that, strangely. The future South Park of the bad timeline isn't unrecognizable. It's just further down the road we're already on. The same instincts, the same cultural patterns, the same corporate logic, the same human tendency to absorb new things into old structures and keep going. South Park became South Park Plus and the Krusty Krab. Wait, wrong show again. The point is, the town adapted. It changed in small, accumulating ways. It kept existing. What the bad future took from it wasn't the physical town. It was the people in it who made it feel like home. That's the distinction the specials are drawing, quietly and without making a speech about it. The buildings are there. The roads are there. The palm trees are there, which nobody asked for, but there they are. What's missing is the community, the specific people who held it together, who knew each other, who turned up for each other's funerals. And in the good future, those people are at the Christmas party. The town is presumably still South Park Plus, still with its insect protein menu, still with a dried pond and palm trees, and a closed police station. The physical world didn't restore itself when Kenny fixed the friendship. The climate didn't reverse. The institutions didn't rebuild. What changed was only this. The people who knew each other showed up in the same place at the same time and said something to each other and meant it. That's the whole difference between the two timelines. The town is the same, the people are together. And that makes it, improbably but genuinely, enough. I want to spend a few minutes on the bigger picture before we start winding down, because there's something worth sitting with in what the post-COVID specials chose to do and why. South Park spent more than 2 decades being the show that committed to nothing. Not nihilistically and not without craft. The show is genuinely very good at what it does, but with a specific operating philosophy of satirical neutrality. It would skewer everything, it would take nothing entirely seriously, it would resist the invitation to stake out a position for fear of becoming exactly the earnest, agenda-driven content it was parodying. Sincerity, for most of the show's run, was treated as suspect. Caring openly about something was the setup for a punchline. And then, in 2 specials, it made a choice. It said, "The friendship between 4 boys matters." Its collapse had real consequences. Those consequences were worth treating seriously, without ironic distance, and without a twist to undercut the sentiment. It made Kenny, the dying joke, the punchline, the hero of the whole thing, unambiguously and without walking it back. And it put the moral of the story in his mouth in the most direct language the show has ever used for something it actually believes. The friendship breaking was the mistake, and fixing it was worth a lifetime of effort. That's a remarkable thing for South Park to say. And I think it lands precisely because it took 25 years to get there. The bad timeline is what happens when nobody does anything. The boys drift. Their worst qualities, Stan's tendency to retreat, Kyle's inability to let things go, Cartman's self-interest, whatever specific friction drove the final rupture, get to run without the counterbalancing force of the actual relationship. The habit of each other breaks. Stan ends up alone in an apartment talking to an Alexa. Kyle ends up combative and isolated. Randy ends up in a nursing home beside a sprout. The town loses its pond. The good timeline isn't the absence of all that. The same people, the same tendencies, the same pressures, but with the relationship intact. And what changes downstream from that single preservation is everything. Sharon survives, Shelley survives. The Tegrity weed gets distributed and heals the town. Stan goes to Mars, Kenny wins a Nobel Prize, Timmy walks into the party, one friendship held together, everything else follows. The show was saying something quite specific about the pandemic's particular damage. Not the virus itself, but the isolation, the way the years of lockdown and fear and uncertainty trained people out of the habit of each other. The way relationships sustained by proximity suddenly had to survive on something more deliberate, and many of them didn't. The way people retreated into themselves and lost the generosity that long friendships require when they stopped having the people around them who knew them well enough to push back. The bad future is that damage extended to its logical conclusion. The good future is what happens when someone refuses to let it run. And the person the show chose to embody that refusal. After 25 years of building a character who died every week and let it be a joke, is Kenny. The kid in the orange parka. The one nobody could understand. The one whose curse turned out to be, in some strange and specific way, the exact right equipment for the job. He'd spent his childhood dying and coming back. He spent his adulthood using that same refusal to give up on the thing that mattered. That's a very particular kind of heroism. Quiet, unglamorous, patient to the point of absurdity. 40 years of working on one problem in a lab while everyone else moved on because he couldn't let the friendship be the thing that didn't survive. The show has spent 3 decades refusing to let its characters be simply one thing. Cartman is both monstrous and strangely redeemable. Randy is both insufferable and occasionally magnificent. Kyle is both principled and exhausting. And Kenny is both the running gag and the heart of the whole thing. The punchline and the hero. The one who kept dying and the one who made sure everyone else got to live. That's the future the show chose to give us. It's messier and more honest than most finales manage. And the remarkable thing is that it didn't even need to be a finale to do it. What I find myself returning to, having now spent a lot of time inside all of this, is the question of what it means that the post-COVID specials exist at all. Not as texts to be analyzed, auf Beschworschnitt. Obviously they're texts to be analyzed, that's what we've been doing. But as events, someone at South Park Studios, at some point in 2020 or early 2021, decided that the pandemic was the right occasion to do something the show had never quite done before. Care openly about what the future looked like for these characters. And someone else agreed. And the result was 2 films that are deeply, unironically invested in the idea that the friendship between 4 boys from Colorado mattered, and that losing it would be genuinely bad. That is, for a show with South Park's specific history, almost a revolutionary thing to do. South Park spent the better part of 25 years pushing back against exactly that kind of investment. Against shows that ask you to care about characters and mean it. The whole brand was built on the endless puncturing of sentiment. The punchline that arrives just before the emotion can fully land. And it did that brilliantly for years and built a genuinely devoted audience on exactly that quality. And then it made the post-COVID specials, and in them the sentiment landed. The moment wasn't punctured, Kenny was a hero, and the friendship mattered, and the good future was genuinely better. And you were allowed to feel something about that without the show winking at you and reminding you not to. That doesn't mean South Park became a different show. The specials are still full of jokes, still satirical, still willing to be crude and silly and provocative in the ways the show has always been. The bad timeline future still involves Randy sleeping with a pangolin and a disease being named the Kenny McCormickrin. The Nobel Prize is for combining dark matter with breast implants. The show didn't lose its voice. It just turned out the voice was capable of more than one register. What you take away from all of this, from the 2 timelines, from the characters' futures, from the whole elaborate architecture of the specials, probably depends on what you came looking for. If you're a longtime South Park fan who always thought the show was fundamentally about something, the specials are a kind of confirmation. If you always thought it was fundamentally about nothing, the specials are an interesting anomaly. A detour into sincerity that doesn't necessarily change what the show is in general. Both of those readings are probably partially right. What I believe, for what it's worth, is that the show has always cared about these 4 characters more than it was willing to admit. The sustained investment across 25+ seasons, the maintenance of those specific relationships, the care taken with continuity even in a show famously cavalier about continuity, was always evidence of something. The specials are the moment when the show stopped pretending that wasn't true. Kenny knew this for a long time before the show admitted it. Of course he did. He was the one who was paying attention when nobody else was. I've been sitting with all of this for a while now, and what keeps coming back isn't any single character's future, but the shape of it together. 27 years of a show. 4 kids at a bus stop. an endless winter that turns out eventually to have an end. South Park has been renewed through at least 2030, which means more episodes, more seasons, more Randy doing something catastrophically ill-advised, and more Cartman being both the worst person in any room and somehow also the most interesting person in it. The show isn't done. The bus stop isn't going anywhere. The boys will keep being boys, or whatever the present-day version of them is, 10-year-olds who have survived 28 seasons without aging a single day, which is its own small kind of miracle. But in those two specials, the creators did something they'd spent most of their careers resisting. They looked at the characters they'd built across decades and asked, where does this go? And then they showed us two answers. The version where things went badly, where the small frictions won, where the friendship dissolved and the consequences rippled outward across 40 years of burned farms and dried ponds and quiet, lonely apartments. And the version where someone cared enough to not let that happen. Not a perfect version, not a tidily resolved everything. In the good future, Cartman is still homeless across the street shouting at the dark, because some things are apparently beyond the reach of time travel and friendship repair. Clyde is still unvaccinated because Clyde is constitutionally Clyde. The world still has insect protein, and Denny's, Applebee's, Mac's, and the Park County Police Station is still shuttered. Things that are wrong remain wrong. The fix isn't the absence of problems, it's the presence of people. Stan at the Christmas party instead of in the empty flat. Kenny at the party with a Nobel Prize instead of a video left in his body. Timmy walking in, Randy with his glass raised, family beside him. Tweak and Craig still together after 40 years, which is the most uncomplicated, happy ending anyone in the whole thing gets, and they deserve every bit of it. What strikes me, having spent this much time with all of it, is how much of what the post-COVID specials are doing is essentially saying, the ordinary stuff matters. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic moments, the phone call, showing up to a funeral, staying together, inviting someone to spend New Year's, giving away the weed you'd been hoarding instead of holding on to it as a symbol of who you are. The ordinary stuff, the small continuities, the habit of each other. There's an episode in the show's earlier seasons. It's the Christmas episode, the one where Squidward dresses up as Santa because SpongeBob is crying. Wait, no, wrong show. There's an episode in South Park's earlier seasons where the boys do something incredibly ordinary together, something that has no plot significance and doesn't resolve anything, but which has the quality of friends simply being friends. And the show, for most of its run, has underplayed those moments in favor of the satirical, the outrageous, the plot-driven. The post-COVID specials are the show finally acknowledging that those ordinary moments were always the point. The bus stop, the four of them standing there. Another morning, talking about something that doesn't matter, killing time. In the good future, that's what survived. Not the adventures, not the events, but the ongoing ordinary fact of them still being there. I find that oddly comforting, actually, that the most important thing, when you run the numbers across 40 years and 2 timelines and one very elaborate time machine, turns out to be the ordinary stuff. The daily continuity, the not letting go, that's worth holding on to, tonight and otherwise. There's something nice, I think, about ending a video like this one. A video about futures, about what becomes of people over time, with the knowledge that the present is still ongoing. South Park is still going. The boys are still at the bus stop. Whatever the post-COVID specials showed us about where they end up, the story isn't over yet. There are more seasons ahead, more Randy, more Cartman, more of whatever Kyle decides to object to this week. More of the show finding the particular tone it's always found, that uncomfortable register between sincerely caring and performing not caring, which is, when it works well, one of the more interesting tones in television. The good future the specials gave us is a destination, not the whole map. 40 years from now, in the South Park timeline, the boys find their way to a Christmas party. Everything in between, all the seasons between the pandemic and that party, all the stories the show still has to tell, all the chaos and comedy and occasional earnestness yet to come. That's still ahead. We got to see where it lands. We don't know yet how it gets there, which is honestly a lovely way to leave a show. Not finished, not explained, just here's where they end up, and now go watch the rest. If you're still awake, that's fine. This is a lot to sit with, and there's no hurry towards sleep. Let the characters drift around a bit. Let the images settle. Let the nearly empty pond be nearly empty. Let Kenny be in his orange parka at a Christmas party in Colorado, alive for once, wearing a Nobel Prize around his neck for combining dark matter with breast implants. And if you drifted off somewhere in the middle, maybe around Randy's section or during Kenny's, which is where I'd probably fall asleep if I were the one listening, that's completely fine. That's kind of the point of all this. South Park will still be there in the morning. The boys will still be at the bus stop. Kenny will still be alive. For now, anyway. Good night.